the globe. I want to welcome you to another educative and enlightening episode of the Tadat Coffee Chat, where we try to bring experienced and cerebral panelists to discuss burning issues on international good practice and ease of doing business with respect to the tax sector, as relates to tax authorities, tax administrators, consultants, taxpayers, government, and of course, tax enthusiasts. I hope you have your cup of coffee right beside you. My name is Folashade Koka, a member of the Tadat Coffee Chat team, and I'll be moderating the conversation today. Today, we'll be learning from the wealth of experience of our carefully selected crop of experts, who I'm confident will do justice to the subject matter. Our topic for today is a very important and interesting one that impacts us all one way or the other. We will be discussing today the role of accountability and transparency of the tax administration in enhancing tax payments, tax culture amongst taxpayers. To do justice to this very critical conversation, join me as I make welcome our distinguished panelists in no particular order, starting from Mr. Eric Manser. Mr. Eric Manser, I'll be giving a short bio of each one of the speakers. Mr. Eric Manser is the founder of Center for Tax Research in Ghana, a think tank incorporated for tax research and policy. He is also the partner in charge of tax at Sam Okuzeto and Associates, a leading law firm in Accra with over 20 years of experience in the legal profession, with specialization in tax and dispute resolution. He is a highly skilled tax treaty negotiator with vast experience in litigation. He's also served 2 terms as the member on the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters. Join me as I make welcome Mr. Eric Manser. Mr. Eric Manser, you are welcome to the Tadat Coffee Chat today.
Thank you very much for your
kind. Thank you for being here. Yes, sir. Next is Dr. Nara Monkham. Dr. Nara Monkham is an associate professor of public economics and the head of public policy hub at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. She also serves as the chair in municipal finance. Prior to this, she was a director at the African Tax Administration Forum. She has a PhD in economics. Dr. Monkham, you are highly welcome to this episode of the Tadat Coffee Chat.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Emeka Nwanko. Mr. Emeka Nwanko serves in the Domestic Revenue Mobilization Department at the African Tax Administration Forum. He was also at a period the manager of domestic taxes and at another time the program officer. He is now acting as senior management member at the African Tax Administration Forum. Mr. Nwanko at the time also worked with the Federal Inland Revenue Service in Nigeria. Up, because Nigeria, yes, I'm from Nigeria. So Mr. Nwanko, you're welcome. Welcome to the Tadat Coffee Chat.
Thank you, Fola. Hello, everyone.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Yes. So again, let me reiterate the topic for discussion today: the role of accountability and transparency of a tax administration in enhancing tax paying culture amongst taxpayers. Yes, accountability, transparency is usually bandied around and all that. Oh, trying to put up the corporate governance structure, trying to make the organization look good. But we're going to be looking at this and discussing it as relates to tax, as relates to finance, as relates to governance, and how they all come to tie in together to enabling and creating an enabling environment for voluntary compliance so that the taxpayers can do what needs to be done, because the Revenue Authority has invested in structures that enable accountability and transparency within their tax administrations, where knowledge is served to the taxpayers in a way that they can easily understand and know it, and they can easily do the needful as and when due, and the revenue can be brought in, and government can have adequate revenue to be able to drive governance. And they can also declare this to the taxpayers in a way that would continuously enable them to know and have trust and confidence in the government. So we'll be digging into the questions now. And the first question I would like to throw today to Mr. Mensah is, what is the relationship between tax administration's accountability and transparency in influencing tax-paying attitude and culture amongst the populace? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for having me on this program. I think accountability and transparency, for me, is a building block or the foundation upon which you can really get taxpayers to comply. And I look at accountability being that the tax administration is accountable for its actions and for the procedures in which it uses in collecting tax. And when I say accountable, I do not mean that the tax administration is accountable as a result of its discretion or as a privilege to taxpayers. The accountability must be founded in law. That means the law must ensure that taxpayers have a right to demand accountability and transparency. And when you talk about transparency, I also will look at it from the angle that the tax administration does not operate as a secret society, that its procedures and actions are shrouded in secrecy. It just, once it says it, it has no reason to explain itself because it has a power. And I think that was one of the major problems we face with a lot of African tax administrations. They have a problem becoming more transparent and accountable because so much power is invested in the tax administration from the tax laws. So having given my understanding of what I mean by tax administrations being accountable and transparent, I'll say that if they are transparent and accountable, one of the things that would ensure is that taxpayers will trust the administration. Because once they can understand that tax administrations are being forthright, are accountable. If they misuse their powers, they'll be held accountable. If they are enforcing a tax regulation or a tax law, they would have to explain themselves, and taxpayers will have to understand before they comply. Then the taxpayers will trust the tax administrators. Secondly, it will encourage compliance because taxpayers will look at the fact that, well, if a tax administration is transparent and accountable, it means that it will enforce the tax laws in a fair and equitable manner. And the fact that if I'm paying a tax, if a taxpayer is paying a particular tax rate, it knows that there are reasons behind it. If a taxpayer or another taxpayer has an exemption, which is very common in our part of this world, there's a reason for the exemption, probably because it's a priority industry or we want to encourage investments. So once a tax administration is transparent and taxpayers are clear as to the reasons why they are paying the taxes, and the fact that if there is a problem, they have access, readily available access backed by law, and the fact that it is easily available to everybody irrespective of your income. I hope I'm not talking too much.
No, not at all.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so that will also encourage compliance because taxpayers assume that, well, the tax administration is being fair, is being equitable in this administration of the tax laws, and the fact that any misuse of the tax administration's powers will be checked and will be accounted for. And also, it's important that when you are being transparent, you ensure that the tax administration ensures that the taxpayers understand the rationale for the laws that have been passed. And I think maybe when we get further into the discussions, we have had issues in Ghana where the taxpayers clearly don't understand why there's a particular law on a particular income. And there has been total and consistent opposition to the imposition of those tax measures in Ghana, especially because taxpayers don't understand it. People say this is not a tax. This is like, I think we are live streaming, so let me choose my words carefully. This is like taking money from my pocket without meeting the basic principles of taxation. And that has been a major problem in tax administrations because the taxpayers don't understand it. The tax authorities, the government, the administrators were not very transparent with the processes leading to the passage. So those are my initial thoughts. Maybe probably after my distinguished panel members have spoken and you need
Thank you so much, Mr. Mensah. You've given us a capsule that is very, very packed. And one thing I hear you say clearly, the first statement is that it's a building block. So there are stages, and that means that it's a cause and action effect. And that trust is not you earn trust, you don't demand trust. And that when you put the proper structures in place, that trust is built, and the taxpayers learn to trust the system, knowing that whoever goes against that law provided will be dealt with, and that everybody will be dealt with and addressed adequately and equally. So, Dr. Nara, what would you want to contribute to this conversation on accountability and transparency? Over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fola. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay. I just, to add to what Mr. Mensah said, I just wanted to say that just in the area first of the impact of transparency on tax morale. So transparency is not just merely a procedural formality, right? It's also very fundamental, is a fundamental element to actually support the whole tax culture. Because we know that the lack of transparency will erode the trust in the government, and of course, therefore, also impact the tax systems. And then they will also as a result, will lead to basically tax evasion practices. So if we have a lack of transparency, the doubts that will ensue in terms of the tax administration fairness and the tax administration integrity can actually seriously undermine the system effectiveness. For example, we've seen in the literature or in the research that, for example, revealing the names of non-compliant businesses have had really tremendous impact on compliance rates, because they subject the businesses to the social scrutiny, and then aligning, of course, their practices with societal norms. But we also seen that, for example, on the customer side, there's an increasing trend to support, for example, businesses that adhere to tax regulation, and of course, which foster a culture of compliance, right? So that transparency is crucial in promoting a tax-paying culture that actually goes beyond just mere adherence to embracing tax responsibility, right? But it becomes almost like respecting a societal norm there. And we also know that by being transparent, the tax administration can actually go beyond just enhancing compliance. It can actually lead to a robust public finance landscape. For example, the tax administration in our continent can actually leverage technology to help them be more transparent and improve that integrity and efficiency of the tax system at the same time. For example, again, they leverage the digital platform to, for example, encourage tax payments and tax filings online, which would then again bring that increased transparency and efficiency, and therefore that greater taxpayers compliance. And of course, by doing that as well, they will reduce inefficiency, right? For example, that is associated in the system, and because they reduce the inefficiency, that will of course involve also combating corruption in the meantime, at the same time, and also enhancing the capability of the tax administration itself. So that's on the angle of tax transparency. And of course, on the accountability side, as we know, accountability is really crucial also in impacting taxpayer behavior. For example, we know that if we perceive there's a petty corruption with no accountability in our institution, or especially in the tax administration, it will diminish the taxpayers' morale. Right. And if the taxpayers perceive that our tax authority are corrupt or untrustworthy, of course, the willingness to pay the tax obligation voluntarily will be impacted. And as you know, especially in Africa, we rely heavily on voluntary compliance because we do not have the resources to police basically and to enforce a tax payment. So we heavily rely on the voluntary compliance. So actually, tax morale, we need to bring more attention to tax morale that we actually currently doing, because by really, boosting the determinant of tax morale, then we can then rely on that voluntary compliance, and then therefore not stretch our very scarce resources for enforcement, for example. So we really have to strengthen and bring more effort in strengthening the tax morale in our countries. For example, we've seen in the literature that the lack of investigation and punishment for corruption has really contributed to the culture of impunity. And that, of course, if the taxpayers perceive that there's a culture of impunity, especially in our government and our tax administration, of course, that will also undermine. Research have shown that when our tax administration, they fail to investigate internal fraud or corruption, especially when the high-ranking officials are involved, it really undermines the tax compliance as well. And then, of course, we do have internal auditing, for example, but we do need to do a bit more. For example, do we publish the results of our audit, right? Do we show that we incorporating the results of our audit of the tax administration in actually tweaking or improving the efficiency of the tax administrations? So all those elements are really important in boosting, on one hand, tax compliance, tax transparency, and on the other hand, accountability on the tax morale and therefore the tax paying culture. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nara. And I would want to latch on to something that you have said, and that is the introduction of technology into this space to be able to enable and enhance transparency and accountability. So I'll be quickly moving on to Mr. Emeka. What are your thoughts on this introduction of technology into the space to enable and enhance transparency and accountability? And I'll be asking that with respect to audit trails, ensuring that reconciliations are done in a timely manner, and that documents that are submitted by the taxpayers are taken into consideration and they are properly kept outside the Kalamazoo structure of having paper files. And how do we translate this to having those documents in a repository where they will be available for a very long time and no documents or files will be missing, and we'll be able to reconcile taxpayers' concerns easily? Mr. Emeka.
All right. Thank you, Fola, and thank you, Mr. Mensah and Nara, for actually setting a good foundation for the conversation. I think Mr. Eric has already covered the fact that, again, about accountability and holding the revenue authority accountable and responsible in terms of enforcing the law with respecting taxpayer rights and the rest of it. And Nara painted a good picture of the fact that all this is tied to voluntary compliance. And that brings the conversation around technology and talking about audit trail. Because it's one thing to talk about technology and transparency, but we have to look at transparency as maybe the psychological aspect of the human aspect of it. It has to do with trust. Because we could think you have technology, so there should be transparency. But even me looking at the technology might not have the idea of even trusting the technology you've given me, how you built it. So it's about the experience of the person using the technology and the system. So again, this will still go back to the human aspect of it. Talking about reconciliations, because notwithstanding how much audit trail you have internally within the revenue authority, no matter how much records you have, there's the human engagement in reconciliation. So again, it goes back to how does the taxpayer feel engaging with the revenue official in that reconciliation process. So again, we go back to the ethics and code of conduct. They could be written, they could be documented, but does it come through when I experience services from the revenue authority? Do I feel that through the officials that I engage with, or is it just a case of it's pasted everywhere I see it? We have it documented. We talk about we've implemented technology, but in terms of the experience I have as a taxpayer, I don't feel that all those live through the revenue officials. I don't think that is the actual reality of the experience I have. So we roll it back a bit to go back again about creating trust. So yes, with technology and audit trail and all that, those are helpful in terms of the procedure and practice and thinking about, if we talk about the figures, the facts of the case, but we'll still have to come back to the experience because reconciliations are not done through the systems. They're not automatically calculated. It's a bit of pointing out issues, discussing issues, and as commonly said, agree to disagree or disagree to agree, whichever way you take it. So it's about how much a revenue authority is able to have officials reflect these ethics and code of conduct, making sure that even in that reconciliation process, the taxpayer understands that their rights are accommodated, they are respected, the revenue authority is accountable for it, but there's also transparency in the process of how that is handled. And even in building technology, I always say that transparency as a concept is not an end goal, it's part of the process. So in designing technology, how much of transparency, again, and accountability has been built into that system, because it's automated, but it's still built by humans. If I put in my figures and it's computed, how clear is it? I'm able to understand, I think like Nara mentioned, or like you mentioned, how that computation process happens. What happens with the taxpayer engagement outside of that technology for them to understand how it works. And what the revenue authority explains on how it works is that what is experienced. Is that easy? Is it simple and understandable to the taxpayer on how that process works? So that is part of transparency and the accountability part of it. In building that into your, maybe I would say, the design sprints of even creating the technology, you have to think of the experience of the users and how they experience that technology. So that's how we can look at transparency. And this goes back to, again, voluntary compliance, as Dr. Nara had mentioned. Because at the end of the day, maybe one of the tests of actually this transparency and accountability is also the voluntary compliance aspect. Because even when we go beyond revenue administrations, if I'm getting a service, my level of engagement or trust in a product or a service depends on how much, how I feel about how it serves me, what is being offered to me, can it fulfill the objectives of what I'm expecting of it, what is my experience and engaging. So again, we go back on thinking of tax administrations as service delivery organizations versus authorities. So again, when we look at enforcement, we look at the service aspect of it. Because if there's that trust, going back to your initial question, if there's that trust within the revenue administration through accountability and transparency, then there's a likelihood, again, I'm not speaking to this empirically, but there's mostly a higher likelihood that voluntary compliance would improve because people would trust the process, they trust the system they're engaging. So they're more willing to come forward and engage. But where I feel that even exposing myself to the revenue authority is probably me exposing myself to a process I don't understand, a process that is not in my best interest, that might try to not be favorable to me intentionally, then I have a higher possibility or probability of saying, okay, I would want to escape or be out of this system as much as possible as I can. So that for me is the connection. If we're pushing for voluntary compliance, and we can see that with most revenue administrations going the service angle, trying to communicate, we're about services, we're service focused, we're service inclined. We're not an authority. We're not here to put our powers over you. We're here to provide a service to you. But like I said, beyond the lip service, beyond the document and the marketing aspect of it, it has to be felt. It has to be experienced on how the processes and procedures work and how you deliver the services.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Emeka. Mr. Mensah, I'm coming to you right now, but I don't want to lose this thought. Dr. Nara, so I know that culture or transparency and accountability is not a toga that you just wear and you take ownership of overnight. It's a culture that is built over the years. And again, from what Mr. Emeka also said, about the fact that, yes, the technology is good, but at the end of that chain, it's the human interface that will determine whether it is now a garbage in, garbage out, or whether it's actually going to meet the desired need and get the desired outcome. So how do we marry this? How do we create that culture? How do we enable that culture as a revenue authority? How? And I know that this would definitely influence into trainings and all that, but I would like to have your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I think for this, then allow me to then go a bit into, hold on, what the research have shown about the determinants of tax morale. So the determinants of, of course, our tax-paying culture. So what determines my intrinsic motivation to actually pay my taxes voluntarily without anybody forcing me to do so, without having a carrot, or I'm sorry, or a carrot, even a carrot or a stick, yes, to encourage me to pay. So in the literature, we've seen that some determinant of tax morale has been, for example, the perceived utility of tax-funded services, right? How beneficial, what is the value add of the services that the government is asking me to pay taxes for? So that's very important. Of course, we have just talked about the importance of trust in the government. The government has to be able to be trustworthy. Because then it will impact my intrinsic motivation to pay tax voluntarily. And of course, my perception of the fairness of the tax system. How am I perceiving that am I perceiving that the tax system is fair? For example, just in the case, for example, property tax, do I pay the taxes on my house while my neighbor, because he's influential, is not paying? If I see that discrepancy in the fairness of the tax system, why should I continue paying? And interestingly, also some studies have shown that higher tax rate, by the way, can actually lead to stronger tax compliance or tax morale, because it means that it's creating almost like a virtuous circle where, because the tax rates are higher behind it, it means that there's an efficiency of government performance there behind, and therefore the taxpayers' trust is reinforced. So that we have that virtuous circle of efficient government and taxpayers trust. So in some cases, we have seen that higher tax rate can actually lead to stronger tax morale. And of course, demography and social cultural factor affect my tax morale. My age, my education, my gender, my religious belief we have seen in the research that those factors actually impact the tax morale in creating that voluntary tax compliance culture. For example, research shows that older individuals and those with higher education, and women, by the way, and those who are more religious, they tend to be a bit more compliant because they have a higher tax morale. Of course, we already say that trust in government is very important as a determinant of tax morale. And interestingly, for example, we've seen also that although women globally tend to have a higher tax morale than men, in some studies in Africa, we've seen actually the reverse, where it's actually the men that tend to be more, have a higher tax morale than women. But then we have a problem or limitation in our continents because we don't have enough research that is done at a disaggregated level, right? Where we don't have enough gender disaggregated data actually to conduct more in-depth research. Right, so more research needs to be done, more investigation needs to be done so that we can understand the nuances of the gender dynamic in our tax system, or how, for example, the tax policies affect unpaid care work, for example, and how the tax burden varies between men and female in male-dominated industry or female-dominated industry. So we do need to have more gender disaggregated data. And of course, the quality of public services matter. If I see that I keep on paying taxes and then I don't see the value for money, it will impact my social contract. As you know, the fiscal social contract is very key, where the citizens know that I pay my taxes voluntarily to you, government, but in exchange, you need to provide me with those quality services. And some research have shown, for example, just by increasing using those billboards saying this is how this road has been paid by your taxes, for example, or this social security is being paid by your taxes. Just having that kind of messaging is also improving the tax morale. And of course, countries like Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, they're really using that kind of messaging a lot. And then we see positive relationship between the fact that they see service delivery, the quality of service delivery, and then of course, the taxpayer, the tax compliance and the tax morale there. So I'll stop there, and I hope I just gave you an idea of, again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nara, because now I see that it cuts across the globe. When people ask you as a tax administrator or a tax consultant or whatever, that what are the taxes being used for? And it goes back to this conversation on transparency, that a lot of people might not listen to the news and all that, but you need to put something in the public space that would show that taxpayers' money makes this happen. Like in Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria now, the government offers free education to children in primary and secondary school. And so it's easy to talk tax because you're able to say, oh, taxpayers' money makes free education possible. So putting that in the public space for people to see that the roads that they have, the infrastructures, the security is made possible by taxes. So Mr. Mensah, as the lawyer in the house, I would want to ask something that has to do with the tax morale. And I'm looking at oversight functions, the oversight functions of the financial agencies that are supposed to, the ombudsman, the tax ombudsman and all that, and to ensure that there is a check and balance within the tax authority, within government, that would enable trust and build trust in the minds of the taxpayers. And then I want you to take a critical consideration when speaking to that about cost of collection, because cost of collection is critical also. So when you are looking at involving tax ombudsman to look at the transparency and the issues of voluntary compliance and collection of taxes, how do we marry all this together to ensure that, one, the cost of collection is minimal and that it builds tax morale, that taxpayers are able to know that something would definitely be done to a corrupt tax officer or system will be transparent enough to enable them have the necessary closure when they have liabilities.
Okay.
I don't know whether you get the grasp of the okay.
I do get it. I do get it. And thank you for that. And I think it's a very difficult question, really, to address, especially within the context of African countries. And when I look at from my experiences with some African countries, and especially my country, Ghana, you realize that with oversight responsibilities in terms of who polices the tax administration in respect of its duties, its enforcement of the tax law, that's a problem. And it boils down even to the citizenry, their idea of what government is doing. So good governance will first start with probably the central government. The central government is perceived to not be doing things in favor of the taxpayers or the general populace. Like I think Dr. Morcam said, that if you can see that a road has been built, therefore your taxes are being used, then you are more likely to be compliant. But you see that taxpayers, first of all, look at the central governance systems, and then it flows down to the tax administrations. And in Ghana, a lot of surveys have been done in terms of taxpayer perceptions about corruption within the general governance system. And you find that sometimes you find that the tax administration sometimes, especially those who deal at the ports, do come up a little higher in terms of perception as to corruption. And that creates a major problem with respect to tax morale that was discussed by, I think, Emeka and Morcam. Dr. Morecambe. And with respect to oversight, in Ghana, we have the Office of the Special Prosecutor that is probably has oversight with respect to corruption among public officers. You have the Commission for Human Rights that's also supposed to deal with those things. But at the same time, public perception is that the tax administration is too powerful, and that's my take. The law grants the tax administration so much power and ability to be able to literally do anything in terms of taxpayer not paying the taxes and not even understanding it. So oversight responsibility with respect to getting the tax administration to be accountable, it's not well developed. And I think that ties into probably the culture Dr. Morecambe again discussed, sociocultural perspectives. Taxes have always been looked at as a foreign imposition by the citizenry. And so it's difficult to really inculcate that culture into the people, into the taxpayers. And then if you add it to the fact that there's very difficult, accountable procedures that tax administrations themselves do not enforce in terms of perceptions of corruption. You find that there's so much complaints about corruption in tax administrations, I mean, all over the continent, and you do not see a concerted effort to deal with it. So it does affect tax morale. But be it as it may, I think using technology that was discussed earlier by my two panelists as a means of enhancing efficiency in tax collection and then also reducing the human interface, that is a way forward. Unfortunately, because of our very rudimentary technological development in the continent, we find that sometimes the technology fails, either maybe deliberately or because of poor technological advancement and capacity. And therefore, even though a lot of resources have been invested in technology, you still see the human interface. And the human interface is always how would I put, preferable, but for both the tax administration and taxpayers, because there you are able to probably negotiate a way out of the strict regimes of the tax laws. So it's a very complex, difficult cultural
conversation
that we all find ourselves in, that there's a perception that we have the institutions that are supposed to have oversight. And then there's also the issue of the tax administration being very powerful in terms of the laws that have given them all those powers. And then also the fact that even though we are heading towards digitalization of the tax administrations, lack of capacity, and the fact that a lot of the technological tools that we use are imported. And then when there's a breakdown, because of a lack of maintenance culture, we then quickly revert to the default position of human interface. And that is probably a discussion for another time as to how to leverage technology that really works for tax administrations on the continent.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mensah. Thank you so much. Mr. Emeka, you're going to be taking over that conversation, but I'm introducing a bit into because you work with the ATAF, and basically within the space of tax, customer is supposed to be king, and information dissemination is supposed to be clear, accurate, in a manner that they can clearly understand, to be able to drive voluntary compliance and to be able to show transparency on the side of the revenue authority. So what has been your experience? Because I know you'll be dealing with a lot of revenue authorities on that, on the ATAF platform. What's your experience? How can we enable this higher level of stakeholders' engagement to enhance voluntary compliance and to build tax morale and stakeholders' engagement? How can we incorporate stakeholders' engagement as a revenue authority and not take it as if it's a value add or we are just doing the taxpayers a favor, but that it's important and critical to getting to that ultimate goal of voluntary compliance, that we engage taxpayers in a language and in a way that they would understand and be able to comply. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. So I think with that aspect you've added, I'll pick up from where Mr. Eric had stopped on the technology and how it works and what best. And I think from what you've asked, Fola, I think I spoke about design sprints or looking at it as providing a service and thinking of the customer, like you said, what does the customer need? And I think for most African jurisdictions, where it's very important is from the beginning, when you're designing, for example, a policy or making certain changes. Do you involve all the necessary stakeholders, including the taxpayer? How much room do you give in for feedback in that process? I know in countries like Kenya, when you're making an amendment, for example, there's a public commentary period. Now, for most African countries, the process is to have maybe industry consultation or a couple of people engaged on some of those issues. But I know, for example, in Kenya, there's the open public commentary where anybody can write to comment on that suggested amendment or law, which again is the first step in inclusivity in designing, even if it's the policy or the law, the legislation within the country and to get a wider perspective in that context. So it's understanding different types of engagement and at what level do you engage taxpayers and when. But beyond that is what you mentioned about language of understanding, because transparency, like I said at the beginning, again, is not an end goal. It's a process in every step we take. Talking about avoiding human intervention or the garbage in, garbage out. It's about thinking of how would the taxpayer use this? How much transparency can be front-loaded into the process, if I'm to use that terminology, in terms of starting with understanding of the law. How does technology work in the sense that we also minimize dispute resolution by the fact that technology has already anticipated and figured out the areas, or in the design of our processes, in the design of the laws, we've anticipated these areas and provided processes that mitigate against them. Meaning, if we used to have about 70% level of dispute resolution, the system ensures that by end of the day, that might have gone down to 20 or 10 in the first place. So that reduces how much engagement you have in terms of human interaction. But also how much of the process do we digitize and operationalize, and how much of that process do we retain human decision-making for? Because I keep saying experience matters. We spoke about the social contract aspect of it in building the roads, but also the experience of complying with tax obligations and what you think about trusting the system and how it responds to you, which could impact voluntary compliance. And a good example would be, for example, in South Africa, I heard people sharing experiences, the fact that whether it's a VAT refund or personal income tax refund, once you file your return, the system processes it. Of course, the system probably has already risk factors built into it to consider if it requires further compliance verification process or not. And where you have a refund, you get that refund within 5 to 10 minutes after filing and that being clear. Now, when you have such experience, it has a psychological impact on how you view the tax administration and the process. There's increased trust that this is not just about taking from you. This is about applying the laws as it should be and also respecting the obligation of the revenue authority based on the law on what needs to be done afterwards. So that also creates, so these are the kind of things that technology enables us to do in building in those compliance processes, the risk factors, identifying when we can and making sure that, again, if I have a refund, I get it immediately. If I have any disputes, maybe the system flags it immediately and pushes it to where it's to be addressed. And that there's front-loaded information to taxpayers to provide clarity on certain things. And then we come down to the customer service. Running it like a business where if I have an issue, I'm able to reach out either by chat. Nowadays, we have a lot of chat functions. I know most organizations are going the angle of automating to building FAQs to automated chats where you can ask questions, but also having functional call centers that are not there to direct people to another department or to direct people to other places, but are able to provide immediate technical guidance or feedback on the technology side and on the technical tax issues as soon as they can. So you have to have those resources and competence within, again, your call. So call center should not be a traffic center where you control traffic. It should actually be where you provide feedback and guidance to people as the first level of engagement for clarity. So once all these are built into your process and all, it helps in how people feel about engaging with the revenue authority in that context. Thank you.
Thank you. So timely support to enabling timely filing and voluntary compliance. and moving away to ensure that the people that are behind the technology have the requisite skills and knowledge to be able to use it to achieve the results that it is aimed at. I want to take a break to look at the LinkedIn questions, and I'm going to throw this open to everyone here, and I'll be asking for your thoughts and opinions on that. So we have a question on the LinkedIn page, and it goes thus. How do you advise a tax administration to account to the public, especially with regards to tax exemptions and incentives given to investors, so that the public is encouraged to voluntarily pay taxes? The public, at least here in Uganda, is generally not happy with tax exemption regimes, and this contributes to the overall non-compliance. So, Dr. Nara, what are your thoughts on this question, please?
So as we know, our tax expenditure in general system has been very problematic. Has been problematic in Africa. Studies have shown that they tend to actually erode our tax base, and then we don't see the benefit for which, for example, for which they intended to. So usually the cost outweigh the benefit in our tax expenditure. So one thing that I've been recommended again and again is for tax administration to actually, not only the tax administration, because as we know as well, the tax administration that are often kept away in a negotiation for in our tax incentives or tax expenditure processes. So so first, we need to have that unified, centralized way of deciding the tax incentive, so that we know who is clearly benefiting, who's targeted, which sector is targeted, which investor is targeted, and then it's highly recommended that the incentive that are provided are of course gazetted as well, so that the public knows that we have given the incentive to this person, to this type of a sector, or to this company within this sector. And here are the intended, here is the objective of the incentive. Here is the expected impact, and here's the duration. So having a clear transparency approach to our tax expenditure has been highly recommended. Obviously, and then of course assessing, monitoring, and the impact of the regularly monitoring the impact of the incentives is also very key. But of course, we tend not to do it often, so that we then continuously extend them without actually verifying that the intended objective, the intended goals have actually been achieved. And that's where we're lacking. For example, there are countries where you will not, for example, request an incentive without producing like an impact analysis of that incentive, so that we clearly see who will be the winners, who will be the losers, what will be the intended impact, and then we have a continuous monitoring and evaluation impact associated with it. So that's what I would say there, in order to ensure that some investors in the same sectors they don't feel that they have been disadvantaged because others in the same sector have received incentive and they have not. Right? We need to be able to gazette those and publicize those incentives and monitor them carefully. So that's what I will say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nara. Mr. Mika, I'm coming back to you. Earlier on, I heard you speak about ensuring that people get their refunds as at when due, and not just having it on your as a law, or having it on your tax, on your website as a benefit, but in the reality of it, they really do not get those refunds. So how do you marry that with exemptions? And I know you've worked a bit in Nigeria, and the issues of pioneer status, or people having pioneer status for 50 years. How do we marry that to ensure that it's the right people that get the exemptions and the incentives, and that it drives compliance, or that it enables other people to have trust and faith in the system that it is working? Thank you.
Right. Yes. I think a bit of what Dr. Nara has already shared around, again, the implementation aspect of it. Because yeah, most times you go within the laws, within the websites or information circulars of various revenue administrations, we see these incentives published. But there's the part of implementation. How do you monitor and know if people are abusing those incentives? Who is taking advantage of those incentives? How are they doing that? Case in point is what you're talking about, pioneer status, and I'll give a simple example of pioneer status that says, and this is me again loosely using the language, but this is a practical case and issue that's happened, where incentives could say when you start a new line of business, but I'm into manufacturing, I'm not a separate entity, but each time I install a new line, I say I need another 5 years for that particular line. I mean, clearly that's an abuse of such an incentive, but sometimes revenue authorities let those go through. So again, how do you monitor and report those? And this comes back to both accountability and transparency, communicating that. So you want to communicate that incentives are available, they are there, who is supposed to get them. Is another thing to monitor the implementation and also say, provide some information on the tax expenditure, who are those enjoying that, as much information as you are allowed by law to share, but making it public. But beyond the revenue administration, Dr. Nara spoke about the impact analysis, because there would always be within tax where certain sectors feel, because this again depends on the policy agenda of that particular jurisdiction. And other sectors might feel, for us, you didn't give us this. The agenda might be different. So there is the other part of doing the impact analysis and being able to show this was why we did this for this sector or this, taxpayers, and this is the impact it has had and why it was important that this is done. So basically rationalizing and also showing why this is important. That then makes people understand that it's not being used as a political tool. Because again, if I'm to use another loose language, we say on the streets of tax, people largely believe that incentives are created for politically influential people. And that is something you can't ignore. You have to find a way to address and rationalize and make it clear that it is not. It is actually an intentional economic policy. And now we have the issue of just to take this off a bit of administration, how it also ties back to policy now and legislation and the global development. We're talking about global minimum tax at 15%. So if we're not also having these conversations at domestic level, even rationalizing, there is now the global aspects that has an impact where you could lose certain taxes for something that you might not be actually gaining benefits, where you've not done the cost benefits in that context. So it becomes more important with respect to tax expenditure and incentives to look at those deeply and clearly to see how that works, how you communicate that. Because I keep saying sometimes we do the checklists where we say we have this, we've published this, we've done that. But beyond that, how have you intentionally tried to use it to address certain issues or perspectives to communicate to taxpayers to provide clarity beyond just having those and saying it's available as a checklist? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Giving testimonials to show others why the exemptions were given and what value adds they've been able to impact on both the government, on the companies, and on the tax administrator. Mr. Mensah, looking at the exemptions and incentives, I'm going to be playing a bit of the devil's advocate. Yes, I work for a tax authority, but I'm going to be looking or standing in the shoes of the taxpayers now. Why is it difficult, or how can taxpayers actually demand performance of the exemptions and incentives? And why do we have little or no adjudication on this to build capacity in jurisprudence and precedents for taxpayers and tax authorities? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, for me, really, tax exemptions, when you come, my default position really should be that there should be no exemptions whatsoever, except those that the law has provided for in the income tax laws. But that's not how the world works. And I will happily quote Emeka's, I think, statement that tax exemptions are a tool for people with political influence. I think that summarizes what exemptions really are for in this part of the world. Because if I look at my country, where taxation is imposed strictly by an act of parliament. So if you need an exemption, you need to go to parliament. And who takes the agreements for exemptions into parliament is the political actors, those who have the ability and the power to bring an agreement before parliament to ensure that an exemption is passed or ratified by parliament. So I think Emeka's statement, which I'm quoting, it's not my statement, is that truly exemptions are purely made for people with political influence. And you find that if you do the cost-benefit analysis that Dr. Morcom even asked to be done, clearly there is no real benefit for the country with respect to exemptions that are being granted, because you see that if you see the tax expenditures that's foregone, it's huge. And I think for Ghana, for some time back, it was almost about 7 to 10% of GDP in terms of tax exemptions for tax foregone. And so my default position would have been, but like I said, this is not an ideal world. So I will go with Dr. Mokam's proposal that these should be published. I mean, before a tax exemption is granted to any industry or to any business, I mean, that's apart from those that are in the income tax laws. It should be published, it should be made public, and the public should be invited to make some contributions towards those tax exemptions. And then probably it should be defended by the industry or the people who are asking for the exemption. And then the tax administration should also be asked to give their inputs. You'll find that in most of the instances where tax exemptions, very, very huge tax exemptions have been granted to industry, it's imposed on the tax administration. The tax administration finds that an agreement that's granting an industry or a company or an investor a tax exemption has been placed before Parliament. Parliament has ratified it. So all it has to do is to implement it. So I believe strongly that having it published, I mean, every kind of exemption may reduce the demand or the requirement for exemptions, because you find that if I'm in, let's say, in the mining industry and I'm setting up and I'm giving an exemption, somebody who is already in the industry and has been working without any exemption and has been doing very well, making profit, would ask for it. And I'm saying this, I mean, on authority, that it has happened that in a particular industry in Ghana, because new entrants were granted exemptions, the old actors all brought requests for exemptions and were granted exemptions because, to be fair to them, they also were in the same industry. So I think a publication of every application for exemption, the cost-benefit analysis, and then input by the taxpayers and by the tax administrations, and then the defense of the requirements or the application by the people applying for it would probably help minimize some of the negative effects of tax exemptions. But those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mensah. So viewers, I'm sure you would agree with me that we have very knowledgeable and insights and very knowledgeable tax practitioners. And luckily for us today, alongside our very knowledgeable speakers, we also have very attentive viewers on the LinkedIn page. So they're interacting with us and we're having a whole lot of questions. So my panelists and my speakers, you're going to have some questions that you just have to do justice to, no matter how many. So one of the questions that we have is, what type of accountability is better for a tax administration? I know we've spoken a lot about accountability, transparency today, but someone is asking that what type of accountability would you advise for a tax administration? Is it administrative accountability or judicial accountability? So in no particular order, who would like to give that question a go?
Maybe I'll start.
Okay, thank you.
from my experience, I think judicial accountability will be the best. Because if I look at, and in fact, and it's what we are heading towards in Ghana, because if you look at the income tax laws, when it came to probably a dispute between a taxpayer and the tax administration, in respect of maybe probably a decision by the tax administration, your first recourse is to the tax administration. And I think research has shown that it's almost impossible to get a remedy because the person who's made the decision is the person you are appealing to. And that's an administrative accountability. He's been asked to look again at his actions. And clearly, there's no way he's going to say that I did wrong or I miscalculated. So I think for accountability, it should be clearly a higher body, even if it's not full judicial accountability. And like Ghana has amended its laws and included an independent tax appeals board, probably those measures beyond the tax administration should be the, I think, preferred mode, not administrative accountability, where the tax administration is a person sitting on its own case and determining whether it has erred or done the right thing.
The judge and the arbiter. They become the
Yes.
judge and the arbiter in their own case. Okay,
Yeah,
Dr.
that's correct.
Nara, your thoughts on this conversation?
So that's just adding to what Mr. Mensah said. That's very important, definitely. To having and added to that, we do also need to have all independent oversight, right? We need to be able to conduct having an independent oversight entity that actually conduct, let's say, audits on our tax administration. And then, of course, they should be able to also publicize the results of the audit and then the tax administration should be able to to show how they have incorporated the outcomes of the audit. So we need to have that audit clearly done to increase that level of trust and that level of integrity that would therefore also be important for tax morale. But I just wanted to also add to what Mr. Mensah said. So not only we will have we need to have that independent institution that is dealing with tax appeal or dispute resolution. Remember, I think most of our tax administration, correct me if I'm wrong, whether in Francophone Africa or Anglophone or even Lusophone or even in the North, most of our tax administration should have a taxpayer charter, correct? So in that taxpayer charter, you are as a taxpayer aware of your right and your obligation, right? And then, of course, you need, and if not, then the tax administration should be able to then having that clear stakeholder engagement and consultative process where the taxpayer is aware of the taxpayer charter saying, this is your right, but this is also your obligation. And this in your right, you have 1, 2, 3. So therefore, the tax administration should not have a complete power. And that's the reason why there's been a trend to actually call the taxpayers customer, because you can't abuse a customer, right? The customer will have recourse when you abuse him, right? So we need, the taxpayer need to be aware that it's not just, oh my God, this powerful entity, I just have to pay my taxes and shut up. No, we have rights. And then we, of course, the tax administration and the government in general need to put the system in place so that those rights are actually exercised in a way that is fair.
Thank you. Mr. Emeka, your thoughts, please.
Yes, I think while I agree with Mr. Eric, I'll take a little bit of a different dimension to that. I don't think it's a total dependence on judicial accountability, because we have to look at the practical element of it, especially when we're talking about the continent, because now we have to look at institutional efficiency, because solving a problem is not by just creating institutions. It's about, I keep going. What do you experience through those institutions? So I believe it's a two-layered approach or a balanced approach. You still need the administrative accountability, which are inbuilt within the revenue administration.
Wow.
I will actually concur,
Okay.
and that's where the technology can actually play a huge role.
Okay. I think Mr. Emeka is having a bit of a glitch. So I think in the interim, we should move on to the next question. So I know that a lot of us have had the story of the three blind men looking at a cow or a horse from different sides and pinpointing critical things that they were able to identify from looking at it from whichever side of that cow or that horse. So the next question is, what will that component be if you were trying to pinpoint the most crucial and potent elements influencing the role that accountability and transparency plays in tax administration? Mr. Emeka, you are welcome back. So I want you to finish off on what you were saying, and maybe you can also start off on this next question about letting us know from looking at this cow from wherever you are standing. Can you clearly let us know what the crucial and potent elements you can see that is influencing the role of accountability and transparency in a tax administration? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Apologies. More reason why, again, technology is not always the silver bullet or the golden bullet. As I was trying to talk about this, I think it's still important that within the revenue administration that accountability is built in. Because the first point, again, going with Nara mentioned the idea of the taxpayer being the customer, and I'll keep going back and looking at revenue administration as a service provider. Your experience, your encounter, because I think we also get quite technical within revenue administration when we think about what needs to be done. But we need to start thinking of ourselves within revenue administration as people that provide services. And the first encounter is with the revenue administration. And if there's no accountability at that level, if I'm a taxpayer that is disenchanted, because we're talking about social contract and all, which on the continent we know what it looks like, what is the confidence I even have to go beyond revenue administration to seek accountability at another level? Do I run the risk of being subject to investigation and audits for other purposes, just as a way to address, again, me trying to take that up? There are many factors we have to consider. So it has to be built within the revenue administration level first. Where all that fails, there should be possibility, of course. There should be that oversight, because that will put the revenue administration on its toes to know there's someone else to address this issue. It could be brought up at the ombudsman. There's an oversight, function. There's the anti-corruption, which has to deal with staff who do certain things, because this is how you make sure, yes, the revenue authority responds. But within the revenue authority itself, the idea should be that at my first engagement, I'm able to get that accountability before I think of going to another level when it fails. Because that is the first experience, that is the first encounter, and that is how the system improves itself. And this should be communicated. The reports should also, whether it's the annual reports or periodical reports, should also reflect what the revenue administration has done, where it has identified such issues, what it has done to address such issues, and let taxpayers know that this works. You can reach out to us if this happens. This is how you should reach out. This is what we're building into our processes to make sure that you hold us accountable. So Revenue Authority being open to such engagement and getting feedback and addressing issues. And that ties to the question you asked about what is important. I don't think one element is important. Dr. Nara spoke about, again, the social contract. It's a very critical aspect, but I like to put this as an external factor. Unfortunately, Revenue Authority collects but doesn't spend, if I'm to simplify it that way, because we have to simplify the communication, again, when we speak in terms of taxpayers also understanding. So when it comes to the social contract, Revenue Administration collects but doesn't spend. So this becomes a whole of government conversation around social contracts. How do we as a government make sure people see value for the tax they're paying, they're getting the public services? But if we bring it back within the revenue administration, which is solely within the control of revenue administration, what is important? And I keep going back to the experiential part of it. When I hear Federal Inland Revenue Service, do I think of an enforcement authority that is coming down on me, doing everything to collect as much as they can? Or am I thinking of an organization that I can work with to know what my obligations are and pay the right amount of tax in an easy and friendly manner? So what is important is, how do we build into our services? How do we communicate with taxpayers in terms of knowing the obligations and providing those services? So it starts with our communication and engagement. How inclusive is that? How open are we to feedback as a revenue administration, and what do we do to address those? Do we build in these things into our process, or do we wait for it are we reactive? Are we proactive, basically? Do we react to it when it happens, or do we think of a future-proof process that constantly looks at how do we build in transparency and accountability within our communication processes, our technology, and every engagement we're having with taxpayers. So it's not it's a multi-pronged approach. Basically, it's multifaceted, if I'm to put it that way. But the primary part of it is understanding that end of the day, there's the practicality of it and there's the psychology of it. It's mostly about how the taxpayer feels. How do you make the taxpayer feel in engaging with the revenue authority?
Yeah. So, Mr. Mensah, in a short punch, how do you see, or what do you see from your side of standing beside the cow or the horse with respect to this conversation?
Well, thank you. I think from my perspective, I think basically there should be fairness. I mean, the taxpayer should have a perception of fairness. As tax laws, procedures should be and policies should be implemented and passed in a fair and transparent manner, in the sense that taxpayers should have a say. You find that a lot of times when the laws have been made and then it's about ready for passage, then stakeholder engagement or stakeholder comments are invited, and you hardly find any inputs being really taken on board. So I think where the taxpayer believes that I took part, I was part of the whole process. And so what has been done is like a compromise of various positions and perceptions. Then you find that people are more likely to be compliant, in the sense that they perceive that, well, even though I'm paying more than the next person, I was part of the decision-making process. So at least it's fair. So I will look at it from that angle, that where there must be fairness and transparency with respect to especially the implementation and then the passage of tax laws and tax policies. Everybody must be able to have his or her voice heard and then taken on board, even if it doesn't change the final product. At least you have been heard, and then you have been educated on why a particular measure was implemented. Thank you for that.
Dr. Nara, over to you.
Okay, so I will say, so the value for money is definitely key, and of course the trustworthy government that basically the government has done its part to show that it can be trusted, and then that's related, of course, to the culture. Do we have a culture of impunity? Do I perceive as a taxpayer that is a complete culture of impunity? For example, if there's something like that, then of course that will impact my trust, right? And then of course, is there, for example, a process or a mechanism to report on ethical behaviors? For example, is there a whistleblower protection, or first of all, a whistleblower mechanism? And then if I am actually a whistleblower, am I protected? So all of that is wrapped up in that culture of impunity, in that trust. And of course, lastly, that perception again of fairness. We should not perceive the tax administration as being unfair. Like some investors treated more than the others, some politically influential people were treated better, or completely out of the tax base because of their political influence. So there must be that fairness and equity within the tax system. So those are the three things that I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I basically saved the last question, the best or whatever for the last. It's basically on the informal sector. And I'm passionate about the informal sector because I believe that Africa has a big growth area in that regard, and that governments should be invested in trying to mine that place to ensure that optimal revenue is generated. So someone is asking that in sub-Saharan Africa, we know that informal economy is too high. Are there figures about the level of trust of such taxpayers in their tax administration? So I would just throw this into the space here and have anyone just
maybe
give
I'll
any
start
contribution.
there. Yeah.
Yes.
So by definition, the informal is hidden, right? So therefore, they are not part of the formal sector, and therefore they are not part of our tax system. And that's our problem, right? Because the informal economy is actually divided into two. The people who are supposed to be, they are rightly there because they are small, the small traders, the mom selling dough by the street to pay the fees. I mean, those are outside of the outside of the formal sector, because they are, right? There's nothing else to do there. But then we have those taxpayers that are actually hiding intentionally
Absolutely.
in
Yeah.
the formal sector. And as you know now, we're not talking small taxpayers. They actually millions and billions now can be channeled to our informal sector, right? By the way, they represent a large, for example, I think in the 60% of the economy, I think in Zimbabwe, if my latest figures are correct. So they represent a large sector of our economy. And then, of course, our labor market as well. A lot of people, they hire a lot of people in the informal sector. But that's the point, they are hidden there. So the question now is, how do we pull out from the informal sector those taxpayers who should not be there, who are free riding and hiding over there? So what are the incentives that we can put forward? For example, we can say one thing that has been recommended is that everybody who wants public tender, right? You must have a TIN number, for example, right? So we can find mechanism and ways to actually pull those people who are intentionally hiding back into the formal sector. So that's what I would say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Emeka, looking at that question and separating the wheat from the chaff, what say you?
So I guess I would probably play for the devil's advocate to ask, is there really the wheat and the chaff in this context? And why I ask that question is, did we cover the informal sector conversation out of administrative inefficiency, or is it an actual policy issue? Why do I ask that question? You have income tax. For example, you have the corporate income tax or company's income tax, depending on how you frame it within your jurisdiction. And you have the personal income tax, or generally in some jurisdictions, just the Income Tax Act, within which you have the one focused on limited liability entities, and then the one focused on just individuals and enterprise or whoever is in business. So the question becomes, and within these laws, sometimes we have the threshold to take care of those people we now try to refer to as those that are supposed to be informal sector, basically meaning the income they're earning might not require that we have them comply, the cost of compliance in that context. So meaning anybody above that threshold is captured within the income tax. But of course, we know that administratively, it's complex or it's challenging to capture everyone, even within the market space. So again, we have the question around informal sector. Do we just go to the market and collect levies? So why I say devil's advocate is a question of, is the informal conversation within tax a product of administrative inefficiency, or is it an actual real problem of they not formalizing? That also extends conversation beyond the revenue authority. Because again, within a working environment or certain environments, for you to actually do something, you have to be licensed, meaning there's a record, you have a footprint within the system. Then we get to the financial inclusion aspect of it. What are we doing for financial inclusion to make sure that we see the footprints and transactions all those people do to know when they are within, again, threshold or not, to be captured within, whether it's the VAT system, whether it's the income tax system? What are we doing about those? Are we looking at double jeopardy situation? I'm in the market, I provide my own water, I'm supposedly a small business, who normally within the income tax provision, I'm not supposed to pay tax. But now I have to pay levy every week, every month at the local government level because of, again, administrative inefficiency of figuring out if I'm within the income tax net or not. So it's more of questions from me on when we have the informal sector conversation. What is the driving factor behind talking about tax in the informal sector? What is driving that and what could be changed? Is it a revenue administration issue? Is it a wider conversation within our economy or economic structure? Or is it a case of administrative inefficiency and how our compliance systems capture those people within the system? So to answer the question directly, we might not know how they feel about the revenue administration because, like Dr. Nara said, most of them probably don't interact with the revenue administration. Some of the interaction is at the local government level or municipality level, as we may have it, or the ward level, based on levies, market levies collected through associations or presumptive tax. In jurisdictions where there's presumptive tax, we could think about what is the feeling around that. But I know the general look at presumptive tax most times is that it's still hard to collect. And the feeling is still, you're collecting money from us, but we're not getting the public services, which is why we're in this place, which is why we're on the road, which is why we're in these market spaces and all. So it's something that is more food for thought for us to think about around commission around informal sector and how we address it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Emeka. This is a conversation for another day. So I just want to have just your thoughts on it, Mr. Mensah, before we move on to our parting speech or parting words from each of the speakers, please. Thank you.
I think I will again take it from where I think Mr. Emeka left off in respect of the fact that it's a wider issue more beyond the tax administration, because it's the way our societies have been structured. It's an informal society, so it's incumbent on central government to bring in everybody. And I think in Ghana, one way that has one of the measures that have been done to bring everybody, whether formal or informal, into the system, especially the tax system, is what we call the national ID, where you cannot do anything. I mean, you can't open a bank account. You can't even have a phone number without an ID card. And that ID card number is now the tax identification number for the revenue authority. So technically, everybody is now supposed to be within the tax administration system, because everybody is supposed to have a Ghana card, because it looks like without a Ghana card, you literally will not exist or be able to even exist in the country. So it's a structure of the society. Once we leverage technology, we discussed in the beginning of this discussions, and then bring everybody into the system, like what Ghana is doing with the national ID card, which now becomes your tax identification number. And you cannot do anything without it. It means that automatically you have been enrolled into the formal sector of the tax administration. As to whether the tax administration is able to now benefit from this kind of information is another matter. And I think that boils down to whether it has a capacity and the efficient and effective resources to be able to mine the data that it will get from this national ID processes.
Thank you. So that is what the Tadat Coffee Chat is all about. Today we were speaking on accountability and transparency, and somehow we found ourselves navigating into the informal sector, which will be another conversation for another time, as you stay tuned to the Tadat Coffee Chat, where we bring you timely and insightful information on tax and tax administration. I would want each of our speakers who have done justice to all that they have been served as conversation and questions on this Tadat Coffee Chat. I want to appreciate each and every one of them. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your wealth of experience. Thank you for knowledge that you have passed on through this conversation. So I would leverage your final words on what Mr. Emeka said, that yes, tax administrators are to generate revenue, whereas the government is to spend it in line with accountability and transparency. What will be your final words? I would want to start. Well, it's not gender, whatever. Dr. Nara, I have to serve this to you. Please, what would be your parting words on this? Thank you.
So I will say again, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Personally, it's the first time I'm taking part of this Tadat Coffee Chat. Fortunately, we don't see all our participants. It would have been lovely to have maybe opening up our cameras to see who is there. But just to say, I mean, again, thank you very much for inviting me. Final thought, I will just say that definitely, I mean, there's so much more we can do in terms of tax transparency and accountability, because we know the benefit that it can have in our tax-paying culture, right? Especially again when we have scarce resources, because we can't use those resources for enforcement because we don't have enough, right? So we really need to have a heavy focus on tax morale and encouraging that tax-paying culture as much as possible, right? Because our revenue base depends a lot on voluntary compliance. So we need to do more. But it's possible, definitely. But as you can see, based on a lot of what we said, there's a lot of political will behind it as well, right? Do our government actually want to have that level of transparency and accountability? That's the question. And unfortunately, that's the problem that we also mostly have with our most of our government, right? So we must have that political will to establish that environment where transparency and accountability can thrive and therefore lead to tax morale and therefore voluntary compliance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Mensah.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to say thank you for having me on this panel, and it's been eye-opening for me myself too, and I've learned a lot. And I think my last words would be that by embracing principles of good governance and actively engaging with relevant stakeholders, especially taxpayers, I think the revenue authorities can develop systems and procedures that ensure that taxpayers have trust in the system and voluntarily comply with their tax obligations, and thereby ensuring that we have a sustainable tax system. And then a corollary of that is that we'll have a sustainable and stable government. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Emeka, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Fola. Thank you, Mr. Eric, and thank you, Nara. It's been an interesting conversation. And I think, as Eric mentioned, it's also a learning process as we discuss, because we get to hear experiences and perspectives. And I think for me, the conclusive statement would be, and I think it ties to what Dr. Nara said, about sincerity of purpose within our governments, and being open to communicate that and engage with the citizens in terms of the aspects of the social contract. And being quite sincere in opening up to show what has been done with this revenue collected, and where there are shortfalls to be able to engage and explain and get feedback. But this goes to sincerity of purpose in terms of the government. Coming down to the revenue administration, is understanding that accountability and transparency is not an end point, it's not an end goal. It's a living ideology within the processes of the revenue administration, in every engagement, in every process, in every communication, in terms of engaging taxpayers or the citizens at large. But as part of his strategy, also thinking of how it has the whole of government approach to pull in other agencies, other stakeholders to also see how do we communicate to taxpayers what we've done on our side as in terms of social contracts, but also as revenue administration being open enough to show what it's doing to improve accountability, communicating to taxpayers areas of accountability in terms of revenue administrations and what can be done. And again, going back to the sincerity of engagements. And beyond the checklist, and I'll come down to this to conclude, especially in regards to something like the TADAT assessments. Beyond thinking of the checklist process to say, oh, I've passed POA 9, I've passed POA 1, and thereabouts. The question is beyond those checklist process of how you have the law, you have the procedure, you have the committee and all. What are you doing on a daily basis to implement, to show that these things are working or they are not working, and what you're trying to do to make them work? How many officials have been caught within your internal processes to show what they've done wrong and to communicate this? Within the ombudsman, how many cases have been resolved and how do you communicate that? I know with South Africa, the tax ombudsman is constantly sending out mails on issues to also let other taxpayers know what has been resolved, because that is helpful in understanding if you're in a similar situation or to know that you have access to such. So again, what are you doing on a daily basis to monitor, show implementation and what has been achieved beyond just having the checklist of having the documents or setting up the team and the process in terms of that? End of the day, if we say we're providing services and the customer is king, then the primary thing is how do we have an enabling environment for the customer to receive the service? And then that will go all the way back to accountability and transparency, because that has to do with how do they trust us to engage us to provide the service to them. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. It's usually said that there are two certainties in life, but I would want to say that there are three certainties in life: death, taxes, and change. And death and change are subsumed in ensuring that taxes are paid as at when due. It's been 90 minutes of peer learning, engagements, and a lot of information being passed. I want to appreciate the TADAT Secretariat for making the TADAT Coffee Chat possible on a regular. I want to appreciate each of our distinguished speakers for making out time and for actually impacting us with their wealth of knowledge. My name is Folashade Koka. I'm your moderator for today. I want to appreciate you all for going on this learning journey with us, and hoping that you'll be available on the next TADAT Coffee Chat and much more to learn a lot much more in enabling and having an ecosystem that enables compliance and good practice. Thank you so much. And until next time, it's bye for now. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for
Bye-bye.
having us.